Now that we have our new data store set up, let's update our property page to fetch data from an API instead of a static JSON file. For this lesson, we'll be copying keys from Algolia, so make sure that the tab is open in your browser. We'll be talking to Algolia's REST API so we can fetch our property data. REST is a simple way to use standard HTTP methods, like POST and GET, to update and retrieve data from a remote server. It's the most popular API methodology today. We'll use these APIs on multiple pages, and then we'll need setup code and credentials each time we call them. So let's use a plugin to keep down the component clutter, just like Google Maps. Go to your plugins folder and create a new file called dataapi.js. Notice this time we didn't put client or server in the file name. This is because we want the ability to call these APIs through both the server and the browser. Just like Maps, let's export a default function with the context and inject. Next, in your Algolia dashboard, click on API keys in the left menu. Click on the copy icon next to application ID. In our plugin, create a constant called app_id with the value you just copied. Next, copy the search-only API key and create a new constant called API key with the value of what you just copied. It's important you copy the value for search-only operations. If you copy the value for the admin key, then your secret key would be exposed to the whole world to see. Anyone could write to your index, delete entries, add users, and much worse. Next, we need a way to connect to Algolia's APIs and return data so we can display it. The fetch function provides an interface for interfacing with network requests. We'll need it to fetch, get it, data from Algolia. If you want to learn more about it, I've left a link in the description. Create a new function called getHome with the parameter of home ID. Next, we'll connect to Algolia's getObject endpoint. Click on the Algolia documentation link in the lesson description so we can copy some values in our code. Click on Objects Endpoints. Scroll down and click Get Object. We'll be using this pattern in our fetch call. Fetch takes two parameters. The first one is the URL we want to connect to. Let's use this pattern in the docs and fill in our local values. The second parameter is a config object. Here, we'll need to send special HTTP headers along with our fetch request so Algolia knows who we are. Add a second parameter as an object. Inside that, add a property called headers with the value of another empty object. Let's go back to the docs. Let's use these two headers in our request. Great. Now Algolia knows who we are. Now we just have to do something with the data we get back. Fetch returns a promise. A promise is an object that may produce a value sometime in the future. It either returns a resolved value or the reason it's not resolved, like an error. As I mentioned before, Nux uses Webpack and Babel to transform our code for older browsers. So here, we can safely use the fancy new async await JavaScript syntax to make this code nice and clean. Async await lets you write asynchronous code as if it was synchronous code. It's sometimes called syntactic sugar because behind the scenes, it just turns the code into good old promises. Async tells the JavaScript interpreter that the function will contain an await. An await wraps everything after it into a promise and executes that code after the code you're awaiting resolves its promise. Add async to our getHome function. Then assign fetch to a constant called response and await the result. The response we have now is a raw response object. It contains methods and properties for the response itself. We just need the JSON data we stored in our Algolia index. To get that from the response object, we'll use the JSON method. It returns another promise, so let's assign that to a new constant called JSON. Now we just need to return the JSON from the function. Lastly, we just have to use the plugin's inject method to expose our getHome function to the rest of the app, like the last lesson. Remember, inject takes a name and an object. Let's call it data API, and let's add our getHome method. And let's save. Before I forget, let's add this plugin to our Nux config. And save. Alright, let's take this for a test drive. Let's go back to our property page. Inside our created function, let's call this plugin's getHome method and console log its result, using the same route parameters as before. And don't forget the async. And let's save. And let's open our terminal. Now go to a property page and refresh the page. You should see some data in your terminal. Looks like we have a problem. Let's take a look. I guess it helps to actually await. And let's save that. Hey, look at that. We have some data. Now let's update this page to use the API instead of our imported JSON file. Remove our original home finder and created. Next, rename home data to home. Since we already know we're getting data back from the API, this should be it. Let's save and refresh our property page. What's this? It looks like our template doesn't have access to our home object. But how can that be? We know we had data being returned. The reason is subtle. Async await is just syntax sugar around a promise. So by using async in our created function, we're essentially returning a promise. The problem is Nux doesn't wait for that promise to resolve. Nux runs the created function and exits right away. Then our API response comes back, and the rest of that code runs through the next cycle after our template has already tried to render. There's a method that's better suited for API calls. It's called async data. This is a special Nux hook that runs once server side and then runs again client side when navigating to other routes. Whatever you return from async data will be merged with the page's local data object. And best of all, Nux will await your response before rendering the page. Async data is ran before created, so you don't have access to the component instance like this. Instead, it gets passed a context object, just like our plugins. Let's move our created function to async data. Rename created async data. Next, let's destructure our context object using params and data API. Then update our code to use them instead of this. And let's remove our console log. Instead of using this.home, let's return an object with the home property so it can be merged with our local data. Since our only property in data is home, we can actually remove the entire data method. We can also remove our import since now we're hitting APIs. And let's save. In your browser, open your DevTools to the Network tab and filter by Algolia. Go to a property page and clear your network results, and refresh. Great, the page still looks good, and there's no client-side hit because the page was server-side rendered. Go home and click on a different property. Notice now async data is firing client-side and returning the API data. Great, we now have our property page fetching from a live API. This opens up a world of possibilities.